Hi, everybody, and I'm so pleased you've been able to make time in the middle of the working day to be able to join us for this. We're really quite excited about this way of celebrating International Literacy Day in terms of having a wonderful international speaker who's very appropriate for the day. But just before I introduce her and our discussants, I just want to do the acknowledgement of country. So I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Macquarie University land, being the Wallamadigal clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the dream time. I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. So the first time I met, well, the only time I've actually face-to-face met Nicole Patton Terry was in a beautiful historic lodge in the mountains in South Africa. And I'm very sorry to say, Nicole, that we can't quite replicate that experience here, since I'm guessing you're probably in your bedroom or something, and it's about 9 p.m. But nevertheless, we're extremely pleased and proud to have you here. And thank you so much for being willing to be part of this event happening on the other side of the world. It's extremely generous of you. Just by way of background, for those of you that don't know Nicole, she's the Oliver Manuel Borders Professor of Education in the School of Teaching Education and director of the Florida Center for Reading Research, which many of us know very well, and also deputy director of the Regional Education Lab Southeast at Florida State University. Prior to joining Florida State University in 2008, she was an associate professor of special education and the founding director of the Urban Child Study Center, Georgia State University. She founded and continues to direct the Village at the Florida Center for Reading Research, a division that takes a collective impact approach to creating and maintaining research partnerships with diverse community stakeholders, so as to promote reading achievement, school readiness, and school success among vulnerable children and youth. Dr. Terry earned her PhD from Northwestern University's School of Communication Sciences and, it's cut off the printer, disorders probably, with a specialisation in learning disabilities. She was a special education teacher in Evanston Public Schools in Evanston, and before that, Dr. Terry's research, innovation and engagement activities concerns young children who struggle with language and literacy achievement in school, in particular, children from race, ethnic and language minority backgrounds, children growing up in poverty and children with disabilities. Her research and scholarly activities have been supported by various organisations, including the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, the Institute of Education Sciences, and the Anne E. It's cut off the printer Foundation and the Spencer Foundation. Anyway, I need to say no more. It's clear how incredibly well qualified Nicole is, not only in basic research, but also in this incredibly important area of dealing with and understanding the needs of underrepresented populations. And that's something that we thought was particularly appropriate for a day like this. I'd also like to take this opportunity sorry, lost my notes. To introduce Manisha, who will be the discussant for this talk along with me. Manisha is the principal of the incredibly successful Marsden Road Public School, which deals every day with children from a range of different underrepresented populations. So thank you also to Manisha Gazula for agreeing to be part of this special day for us. And without further ado, I'll pass over to you, Nicole.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all here today. Let me go ahead and set this up and share my screen. Let's see. And you all should be able to see my presentation there. So thank you again for having me. I bring goodwill and thanks from my colleagues here at the Florida Center for Reading Research, as well as all of our students and faculty and staff here who are really excited to share International Literacy Day with you. So I thought today we would discuss how it is that I think about how we might deliver on the promise of evidence-based reading instruction for all learners, because that's certainly a big topic these days. I'm sure it's a huge topic for you all there. I thought we might talk about how it is I think about how we might get there to kick off this International Literacy Day. And to do that, I think we have to start with our current context, because place matters. It matters to how we have happened to enter this space today and share this time with each other. It matters to how well our children and families that we serve in our different spaces are coming to the table to benefit from whatever it is we'd like for them to benefit from. It matters to how it is we understand and think about what our role is and how we are going to push our field forward on behalf of those children and families. So where are we today? Well, unfortunately, we're not together. We are sitting apart from each other under normal circumstances, although I do like to spend as much time as possible off the side of an island of a mountainside with Anne. Really, I would love to be there with you today, but we're sitting in the middle of a global pandemic that has really wreaked havoc across the world. I've pulled up this map and I've circled our little place here in the world in North America and your place there, and there's certainly a visible difference between conditions where you are and conditions where we are today. In our country, unfortunately, we've passed the milestone of over 500,000 people who have lost their lives to this pandemic. And so we are continuously dealing with the pandemic right now. And we are currently thinking about all our colleagues and friends and families who, not just here, but around the world, who are currently handling the Delta variant and the Mu variant and the Lambda variant and the variants that are very likely to continue to come and disrupt our daily lives. We're also sitting at a time in which there has been a significant amount of global and civic unrest. In particular, in our country, it's been related to instances of killings of unarmed Black men and women here in the US and others, quite frankly, that have really brought to light a lot of social and racial disparities that are happening in our country and forced us all to reckon with how it is that we understand diversity and equity and inclusion and belonging in our daily existences here in this country. And we watched and witnessed as others around the world have joined us in those discussions, not only on our behalf in our country, but how those issues are showing up in their spaces as well. And the hits just keep coming. We certainly are all around the world experiencing lots of different challenges as humans in our shared space on this planet, whether it be our most recent hurricane here, Hurricane Ida, who made its way from the south all the way up into the northeast regions of our country, took many lives with it, took many homes and damage with it. And folks will be dealing with the outcomes of that for many years to come. The end of the war in Afghanistan and what has happened not only to individuals around the world and in other countries as a result of the US ending its engagement in Afghanistan, but also the many people there and how that has really changed what is happening in their daily existences. School's back. My kids are already back in school. Lots of kids have just started school this week. And so we have ongoing debates around how it is that children should or should not be showing up at school with or without masks happening in our country. There's a very lively school board meeting happening right now in my community about this very issue. And then even there for you all, just recently, you had an incident in which someone came in and terrorized a local grocery store there, and people were hurt and lost their lives there. So there's a lot that's happening in our daily existences, just trying to make it through every day. And I mentioned kids are starting school, and this pandemic has certainly caused us to have some global schooling changes. I know for many of you there, children are still learning at home and with their families and in their homes and not in schools. This was the first day of school in my household last year. I happen to have 3 kids. I have a high schooler, a middle schooler, and I have an elementary school student whose first day of kindergarten, so his very first day of school, was at my dining room table as he logged in for his first day of virtual schooling kindergarten with me. This is their first day of school this year. Luckily, they are off back into their regular school day in their regular school building. I say luckily because it gives me a little bit of peace of mind to know that I'm not managing their learning and my working at the same time as I was last year. But it's also, quite frankly, disruptive and terrifying that they are moving out into the world in a space that is hard to manage for us, as well as when they were at home. And those global schooling changes cause global working changes for all of us. So this is me and my little coworker at the beginning of the school year last year. He liked to make an appearance in all of our different Zoom meetings and other meetings, presentations and things I did throughout the year last year. And now we've moved into a space where we've all become much more familiar with Zoom and Teams and lots of other online platforms that allow us to engage with our colleagues and engage with our students. This was a student meeting. And occasionally now we are finding ourselves able to have more in-person meetings, all masked up and outside, but at least able to share some space together to support our students. And so this was our students' orientation for the semester this year. So there's a lot happening around us, amongst us, that makes it very difficult for us to focus on many things, let alone how well children are doing in school when it comes to reading and literacy. And it is a fair and honest question for us to stop and ask, should we even be having this discussion at all? After all, aren't there many other things that we could be focusing on? I'd like to argue, and I think you would agree, that education still remains one of the best chances we have to design a more just and equitable society. And if you're going to talk about education, you just can't get around reading. It is a gatekeeping skill. It is a gateway into and a pathway towards educational school success and educational success, which gets us to all other types of quality life outcomes that we hope to see for individuals in our society. It's also one of the ways we get to address some of these disparities that we just talked about that have become so much more apparent in our society, and how we make sure that the most vulnerable amongst us are able to engage in our society in ways that we would want for ourselves. So reading still matters. It's paramount in this discussion, and it is absolutely the place where we get to lead for change, bring the talents and gifts and strengths that we have available to us, to bring them to bear on the problems that we see in society, and hopefully make a difference. So how have we been doing, right? As a field, how have we been addressing reading? Well, really, we've been doing quite a lot. Over the past several decades, there have been extraordinary discoveries in how it is that we've come to understand how reading develops, how we assess it, how we teach it, what's happening in the brain, what's happening behaviorally and cognitively, cultural ramifications associated with reading. We come to understand so very much about what is necessary to ensure reading develops and what we do if things go awry. And that, of course, has led us to make significant advances in how it is that we teach reading and reading related skills in schools for young children, for children who have disabilities and conditions in school and outside of school. We've got professional learning opportunities that are based on that science. We've got curricula, we've got strategies and practices, standards, all based on that evidence that we've accumulated about understanding reading. And of course, that has also informed policies that have happened in our local levels, as well as our state and national levels, for how it is that we try to make sure that folks are held accountable to making sure that all kids are learning to read in school. So we've got this fabulous research informing this wonderful practice, which informs our policies and funding, which goes around informing reading. It just all should jive together so well. We have such a well-oiled machine that allows all of this to happen specifically as it relates to reading. And we're not done, right? The wonderful thing about science is you've never had a question you actually knew the answer to. You continuously ask and answer questions that help us learn and understand more so that we can do a better job by our children and families that we serve. And so this is a recent paper that my colleagues and I at the Florida Center for Reading Research wrote in a special issue focused on the science of reading and Reading Research Quarterly. And we talked about what we thought were places that we might grow and learn and discover in reading so that we can do more and do better by those children and families that we serve, because there's still a lot to learn. We certainly don't know enough about how to make sure that reading happens for children from diverse backgrounds, for children who have disabilities, for children who are growing up in poverty. For children who are growing up in rural areas, right? There's so much more that we could know and understand about reading and how to make sure that reading is actually happening, how we teach reading for those different populations of students. So the good news is we're all still gonna have a job for a while because there's much more to learn and much more to do, but we're doing quite well as a field. And so you think we'd be in this lovely place where reading is informing practice and practice is informing policy, and researchers are contributing great knowledge that can be picked up and used by practitioners out there in the field to make sure that kids are reading well in school. But the reality is we happen to be sitting in a moment where there's a lot of growing public discontent about reading. Doesn't matter where you are, what social media platform you're on, what news outlet you're in, what you see, it's a lot of vitriol around reading and what is happening in schools for teaching reading and who is responsible for it and how we should make that happen. And you see this discontent happening with parents and families and school leaders and teachers. And we even see it with journalists now. And you even see it with researchers, because we're not happy either. There's lots of different special issues of webinars and statements that are being put out lately these days around reading and what is happening with reading and science of reading and what we should be doing about reading. Nobody's happy at the moment. How in the world did we get here if things were supposed to be so fabulous? Well, in the US, one of the reasons that we got here, how we came to be living in this particular context, is what we found is that student performance on our national assessment of reading in 2019, so this is before the pandemic happened, those scores started to trend downward for the first time in a very long time. So you're looking at scales, average scale scores for students in grades 4 and 8 here in the US. These black lines represent proficient performance. It's where we'd like our students to be on average. What you first should notice is that we've never been on average at proficient levels. So reading has been something we struggle to make sure happens for most of our children on average. But in 2017 compared to 2019, what you saw was these scores start to dip down. And that was hugely concerning. But when you began to look underneath those numbers to think about who it is for whom these scores are going down, what you realize is that it was the children who are struggling the most with reading in school. And those tend to be our children who are most vulnerable learners in schools. So when we look at 4th grade scores in 2019, what we see is that on average, about 1 in 3 students in the US were performing at proficient levels. But when we broke that apart by subgroups, what you see is really it's about 1 in 2 for white students, but it's about 1 in 5 for Black students and Latin students, about 1 in 5 for students who are participating in federal free and reduced lunch programs. That means these are children who are very likely growing up in low-income households or growing up in poverty. For children with disabilities and English learners, we're only at about 1 in 10. So it's our kids who are most at risk, our kids who are statistically more likely to be vulnerable to not doing well in school, for whom those scores are trending downwards. And it's not likely this problem is going away in the US anytime soon, because our public schools are growing more diverse. So when we project out for what we think student enrollment will look like in our public schools in future years, what we see is that many more Black and brown children are going to be showing up in our schools, in our public schools in the US. So the kids for whom they struggle the most are going to be the majority of students in our public schools soon. And many children in the US continue to be growing up in poverty. So these are rates from 2019 of students who are children under age 18 who are growing up in low income or poor households. And what you see is disproportionately, those children happen to be Black and Latinx and Asian and American Indian students. These again are our Black and brown students in our schools. are much more likely to be growing up in poverty. So those very populations of students for whom we see those scores going down are the student groups for whom we likely are going to see in our schools in increasing numbers and proportions over the years to come. And then we find out that in our schools, these very students and their families are the ones who are going to court in the US to protect their constitutional right to literacy. So this was a story in the New York Times around families who were in Detroit public schools. Detroit is in the state of Michigan here in the US. It is a school district that serves a very large and primarily the primary student population in that school district. They are living in low-income households or growing up in poverty, and they're more often to be Black students or African-American students. And those families had to sue the state to ensure that their kids were actually being taught to read well in school. Because, as it turns out, literacy is not a constitutional right in the US, as it isn't in many countries. And so our students, our families actually have to go to court to get the services that they need for their students here. Our students who are most vulnerable to not doing well in school have to go and get protections from the courts to make that happen. You can imagine why this might be a little upsetting. It makes sense that we happen to be sitting in this moment where there feels like a lot of anger and distrust and frustration around what is happening for our children's reading in our schools, because it shouldn't be happening, right? How is it possible that this is happening here? And what in the world can we finally do about it to fix it? So what's our charge in this moment to address reading for our kids? Well, Tim Shanahan, who's a very prominent reading researcher, hosts a blog that he puts out periodically where folks ask him questions related to issues associated with reading, and he provides his honest judgment and opinions on those things. And so in January 2020, right before the pandemic, he released this blog where someone asked him, why is it so hard to improve reading achievement? And he drew a corollary, likened our situation to that of Jeff Bezos and Amazon, right? What keeps Jeff Bezos up at night? And the thing that keeps him up at night isn't your order and whether or not things are functioning so that you have your order. It's that you get your package to your door on time when it was promised. It's that very last mile that keeps him up at night. And so he asked, what's our last mile? And one way that he talked about that was thinking about how we have such rhetoric around how we're moving our kids' reading forward and whether or not that rhetoric is really resonating with our educators on the front line who are charged with making sure that our kids are reading well in school. Because maybe there's a mismatch between all of this rhetoric they're hearing and what their experiences are when they're working with their students in their classrooms. Because let's face it, for most educators, it's not all bad. A lot of good happens in most teachers' classrooms to support most of their students. And so it doesn't feel like they're doing bad by their students. It doesn't feel like they're not achieving what they need to be achieving for their students. They do know that some of their students will struggle, and they do know that there are processes and things in place that should be helping their students, and everyone is doing the best they can to make that happen. What he asks is that maybe you got to up your game a little bit on what you consider to be the best you can. Because let's acknowledge these current successes that you're having, these things that are working for you, but let's also acknowledge the need to do a little better. And if we do that, because perhaps the goal line is change, maybe we can start to change our practices for our students to make sure they're all learning how to read well in school. And I will put that same problem to us. What's our last mile? What is it that we must be doing? How might we acknowledge what our successes are? And then the need to do better in the way that we do our research and our practice to make sure that we are supporting reading outcomes for our students. Well, let's think about that problem for us researchers in the room. And I'm sure this is a room that has some researchers and some practitioners in them. For us researchers, we have lots of problems and lots of questions to answer. But I think fundamentally, when it comes to taking all this great science and translating that into what we might do to support reading in schools, we have three fundamental problems. It's either we don't know what's working, or we know what works, but we can't get folks to use it, or we can get folks to use it, but we can't get it to happen at scale. And those different problems require different solutions to solve them. And it's not going to take any one of us to solve that problem. It's going to take a lot of us to figure out how it is that we can make sure we understand what is working or should be working, which might require some basic research or intervention studies to help us understand the things that can be changed in schools and how we might promote that change. Sometimes that means we got to go huddle and figure that out and bring it to you. Sometimes we need you to huddle with us to figure that out and bring it to you. But other times we do have a good idea about what works, but getting that to happen at scale isn't really about making sure that people understand fundamentally that knowledge base so much as it is about making sure it's implemented well in the context in which we expect learning to happen. And that requires us working together to understand those conditions that are needed to promote the uptake and use of all this great science that we have, if we really expect to see that kind of change happening. But let's face it, if you're the practitioner in a room, you're like, hurry up, can you get it to me? Because I need to know what I'm going to do to support my children's reading. My students, they're sitting right in front of me. I need to know what I'm going to do on Monday, right? So you're a little impatient with us. And what you expect is that I'll put on my best. This is a meme from Scandal. I don't know if the show you all watched there, but Scandal has this lovely actress, Sonia Carey Washington, and she wears the best coats and with the best bags, and she walks in a room and she just handles it. And that's what you want. You want me to come in as glorious as I am with all of my great reading research cape and just make it happen for you, right? But the reality is, for most of us as researchers, that's intimidating because we don't know the answers as well as we would like to know them. We're still trying to figure that out. And it's hard for us to come to you in a space and say, I'm not sure, but why don't you try this or why don't you try that? And oftentimes that's not good enough for you either. And so instead you get a little bit of Tony Stark, where maybe you'll just get my answering service available to you. But in my best Joe Biden voice, and I promise this is not a political statement, however, it's the best one I could find for us here, I think we might want to figure out how to put away some of this harsh rhetoric that you often see happening in the space right now, and think about how it is that we can listen to each other and work together to make progress on behalf of our children and families, because we all want the same outcomes for them, even if we might take different approaches to get there. So if we're going to work together to make that happen, your next question is going to be, what's the one thing we should do? I love getting this question, what's the one thing we should do? Because it makes it seem so magical, you know? If we, I honestly think that we're pretty smart. You're pretty smart. I'm pretty smart. If it was just one thing that we should do to fix this reading problem, I'm pretty sure we'd be doing it by now. And we wouldn't need to have this symposium to talk about our next steps in reading, because it'd all be done. We would figure that out. But the reality is, this is a pretty complex problem that we're trying to solve together here. So I don't think there's one thing we should do. I think there's probably a few things we should do. I'm going to suggest 4 of them to you. The first is take a comprehensive approach. You really have to start thinking about the context in which we expect learning to happen, if we actually expect the learning to happen in that place. So let's think about my place. This is where I live in Tallahassee, Florida. Down here, right on the end of the panhandle, here are my 3 kiddos here. And I ask myself when I moved here, and I ask myself daily, how do we address reading in this place where I live? Well, I'm going to show you a few heat maps that help you understand this place where I live, okay? So you can kind of see this outline here, Tallahassee, Florida, right? You can see it here in the map, same map, right? And these are different indicators of overall well-being in this area. So, for example, we can think about economic prosperity and how folks are living in this area. And what you see on this map is average household by income, and lower is a darker number. And so these darker areas suggest these are places where there are more low-income households, more people who are living in poverty. Then you can also look at employment, right? Because if your economic prosperity is certainly defined by your employment, right? Again, darker areas here would suggest fewer people who are employed. You should start to see a pattern here. What about adults with some or more college education? Certainly, we know lots of research suggests that how well children are doing in school relates to their parents' education levels. And what we see here, darker areas, These are places where there are fewer people with some or more college education levels. And then if you look again at the same map, you find the percent places where there is a higher percentage of African-American families. So here in the lighter areas, there are fewer African-American families. Where the darker areas go, you see more African-American families. So more families of kids who look like my kids, who look like my family, live in these areas where there are higher rates of poverty, higher rates of unemployment, higher rates of individuals who do not have a college level educated person in their household. That's where Black folks live in Tallahassee, Florida, where I live, where we expect reading to happen for our kids. Well, how do those disparities show up in our schools? On this map, you see these little blue dots are our elementary schools in Tallahassee, Florida, and Leon County schools. So these are schools in my own backyard. And you think again about that map of Tallahassee, think about those patterns and trends that you saw in that map. And now let's see. Here, the red circles are our schools where more than 50% of students were not passing the state reading test in 2019. So those are scores before COVID. And so again, you see down here are the schools where more than half of the students did not pass the state test. And some of these schools we're talking about as many as 70% of students not passing the state test. Here, I've added the schools for where kids, more than 15% of kids have disabilities. So they are receiving services in schools to address the disabilities that have been, they found eligibility for. And as we know, for most disabilities that students in our school-age population are experiencing, they tend to have difficulties in some areas of language and literacy. And so it's very likely that many of these students are struggling with issues associated with reading and language and literacy in their schools. And then you see, these are the schools for which more than half the students are performing below benchmark on school readiness indicators. So as children enter kindergarten here and in many places in the US, we give them an assessment to see how ready they are to benefit from formal instruction in school. And in these schools, that's where you see greater than half the students enter school demonstrating skill sets that would suggest they're not ready yet to benefit from that instruction. You start to see a disturbing pattern. And our university, Florida State, is sitting right here. This is where the Florida Center for Reading Research lives. These are our schools and the conditions in which we expect reading to happen in our own backyard. One thing that should be very clear here from looking at these patterns is that there are many reasons why children are not reading well in school. If we choose to just focus on one thing, we will very likely be limiting our impact, not just of our research, but our science in and of itself, because we often don't do our science in these conditions. And therefore, the things that we create that are based on that science are quite limited in addressing their needs. If we expect the science to make a difference in these contexts, we have to start considering the barriers and facilitators to making reading and learning happen in these places. And those conditions are driven by factors that are happening inside and outside of schools. But when we do have the evidence, it is imperative that we make decisions based on the verifiable evidence that is available to us. We have to acknowledge that we're not starting from ground zero here as it relates to reading research. Just because we don't know enough doesn't mean we don't know many things that we can use to get started. And when it comes to children, we should be certain.
Can we even afford this house?
I'm pretty sure we can.
Pretty sure. With Rocket Mortgage, you can be certain. Not pretty sure.
What's the difference?
Let me show you. I'm pretty sure these aren't poisonous. I'm pretty sure these are parachutes.
Mine has a sandwich.
That's mine. I'm pretty sure you do not run. I'm pretty sure you can take Batista down.
You're on.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure this is trending.
I'm pretty sure these hornets aren't the murdering type. I'm pretty sure we can make it.
Certain is better.
Let's go with certain.
Good choice.
When you're buying a home,
Certain is better. certain is better for our children? Don't our children deserve certain? Don't our educators and practitioners out there on the front lines deserve certain? So we certainly want to be moving and acting in a way in which we are making evidence-informed decisions. And the reason we do that is because sometimes making decisions not based on evidence isn't harmful, right? There are a lot of things we say as humans and think about as humans where there isn't a sufficient evidence base upon which to act. Visual and verbal learners, I'm sure that's a popular one in this crowd, right? Or that sugar causes hyperactivity. We just don't have sufficient evidence to know whether or not those things are true. And in most cases, it's not so harmful. But in some cases, it's quite harmful, like the idea that vaccines cause autism. There's actually a large amount of research to suggest that that's really not true. But we make decisions on a daily basis based on that fact. I myself have made decisions about my own children's vaccination schedule based on that knowledge, even though I know it's not based in science, right? So if we have evidence upon which to make decisions, we should make sure we are making those decisions based on that evidence, because we don't have to guess. We happen to know quite a bit about what works. That doesn't mean we know everything. There's a lot that we have to learn about what works for whom and under what conditions and in what ways. But starting with what we know helps us increase the odds that we'll have the outcomes we expect to see and want to see for the children and families we serve. And we also know that coming in later, once children have failed, to try to fix problems that already have emerged is much harder and much more costlier, and not just financially, also social emotionally, as opposed to intervening early and addressing those needs when we can, as we know we should. So we should act upon that evidence. And when available, use evidence-based resources available to you. In many cases, there is no need to invent the wheel. There are times in which we need to be innovative and address a hole that isn't available to us. But we now happen to live in a space where the world is so small that there's such preponderance of available tools and resources that are based upon evidence to support reading outcomes for kids in schools. For example, FCRR, on our website, we have over 350 what we call student-centered activities, which are like instructional plans that can be used for literacy centers and classrooms. They're available from pre-K to 5th grade. They're available to download for free and can be used at any time. There are even demonstration videos available of some of these activities. Lots of resources there available to you. You do not have to reinvent the wheel to make that happen for students in your classrooms. And certainly there are colleagues there near and dear to you who are also making these kinds of resources that are available to you based upon evidence to support early language and literacy outcomes for your kids. I suggest you use them. I suggest we look at them. I suggest we be a critical consumer of them, because there's a lot out there and it's hard sometimes to make your way through all the different things that are available to you, but there's no reason to suggest that they don't exist. And there's no reason not to try. But as you do this, I suggest you also resist the urge to do it alone. I really think that one of the strengths of our field is the fact that it is so interdisciplinary, and that there are so many perspectives that have been brought to bear on how it is that we understand reading and language and literacy and what that means for our kids. It is that collective that is our strength. But in order to act upon that diversity that we have amongst us, we've got to work together to do it. And I don't mean working together by sharing each other's logos. Partnership is not just a value, it is a tool. You have to do something with it to make it work. So we, for example, on the research side, we've been talking about how it is that we get better at translating the science of reading so that it can actually be used in ways that support reading outcomes for kids. One of the things my colleagues and I have talked about, and what you will notice, is that these colleagues are quite varied. There are colleagues here in education and in special education and in communication sciences and disorders, folks who are in universities and outside of universities, folks who are in children's hospitals working together to try to think about how we take what we know and translate it in such a way that it can be used. And one of the things that we've discussed is that, you know, we all have different strengths that we need to bring to bear on this. Some of us are superstars at methods, and some of us are really great at communication. Some of us are really good at thinking about things like barriers to access and equitable access to opportunities. We have folks who can think about this in many different ways and take those skills and talents and use them in many different ways. And so we've talked about making teams to work together and using team science to make that happen. And certainly you see that happening for us in the way that we engage with our own stakeholders in our own backyard. So this is one project we have with our local school district through our Read Up research practice partnership, where we were delivering evidence-based literacy resources into our schools. You all in your own backyards have places like this available to you, whether it's the snow report that's out there with Pamela Snow, or you've got the Solar Lab now, Thinking Forward Educators, lots of different groups who are bringing their collective strengths together to help us understand and make use of all the science to improve reading and language outcomes for kids. Make use of those, join that conversation. But when we ask our educators to join the team, when we're asking them to come together and think about how to make this science work in their spaces, we have to be cognizant of what we're asking of them, because the jobs they have and the supports that are necessary for success in their jobs are not the same. They've been evolving. We ask so much more of our educators on the front lines than we ever have before to make sure that we ensure school success for our kids. They've got to think about standards and assessment and accountability. The students that they teach, that student body is much more diverse in their needs and their strengths and talents and gifts that they bring to the table. The technology that is available to advance learning right now, it is happening so fast. We all certainly saw that during this pandemic. I can't tell you how many apps I had to open just to help my own kids engage in their learning in their schools. And there's a new app every other day, right? So they're not just teaching academic content, they're teaching STEAM and STEM and STREAM and project-based learning and social emotional learning and all the other things that come along. Oh yeah, and evidence-based reading instruction. Lots of demands on their time, lots of demands on their professional space, and fewer resources to make that happen. And many of them, certainly in our case here in the US, often have to have 1 or 2 or 3 jobs just to make a livable wage here. So not only do we not have enough teachers, our supply and demand is really off, but making your way through this teaching profession isn't necessarily a desirable one for everyone. We don't make it look great. You don't make a lot of money. You get a lot of vitriol thrown your way. The conditions under which you're working are not always the best and not always positive, and it constantly is changing. And the pathways that we need to design to ensure success for our professional educators are quite complicated and very difficult, and it's hard to judge. And we have to consider that when we come to the space and say, but make sure you know about that reading instruction, because there's a lot our educators are expected to know about. It doesn't mean they shouldn't know about reading instruction. It doesn't mean they shouldn't know about this science, but it does mean we have to acknowledge and account for the fact that we're asking quite a bit of our educators, and much more than we used to ask, to ensure outcomes for their kids. And when we ask our communities to join that conversation, and if you're not, then you should be asking your communities to join that conversation, because they too are responsible for reading outcomes for children in their communities. You've got to ask, what are the priorities, and who decides and who benefits from the work that you do in those spaces to ensure positive reading outcomes for your kids. This is a guide that was produced by Chicago Beyond. It's a group here in the US, and they put together a guidebook to think about inequities and power that happen in these spaces when we ask communities to join in this research that we do. And there are real issues there that you have to be honest about and have to think about if you expect to see that evidence make a difference in those communities we want to serve in. We've all done written a grant or written a paper or written a thesis that suggests that we're doing this work to address achievement disparities that might be happening in our communities. But have we actually done that work with the people we're trying to support? Have we considered what they think their priorities are and how they think it should be addressed? The work they may well, in fact, be doing in their communities to serve reading outcomes for kids in their communities. All of those things matter. And if we aren't considering that in the way that we develop our science and the way that we enact this evidence, then are we really sure that it's making the impact it needs to have on our communities? So I'll leave you with the last thing I think we want to think about. And all of this, what I hope was very thought-provoking conversation, is really the final thought, which is that we must insist that all our kids can learn. And you might think that we as educators or even as researchers, that's a fundamental basis from which we stand to do the work that we do. But the reality is we vary there. We all do not think and have not always all insisted that all of our children are capable of learning. We often approach our children like there's a problem. There are these achievement gaps and we must address them and we must fix them, right? Because something's wrong with these kids and let's do something about it. But the reality is most children around us are just what we see in front of us is a response to the conditions in which they are growing and learning. And oftentimes, once you look below the surface, you realize it really makes sense what you're seeing. So instead of treating our kids like they're problems to be fixed, why don't we instead insist that all of our kids are capable of learning and that there is something we can do about it? We can make that happen. All of this knowledge, all of this science, all that we understand that we are able to do in partnership with each other, we can absolutely insist and make sure that all our children are learning and growing in school. And the only thing that's stopping us from doing that is deciding. It's a choice. We can choose that all of our children are successfully learning in school. The only thing we have to depend on is whether or not we're willing to make that next step, go to that next last mile to make sure that all our kids are learning in school. It is absolutely an equity issue. I'm sure many of you have seen this graphic before. It's gone around social media a million times over, and people use it quite often to talk about equality versus equity. A very simple way of understanding equity is that equity means everyone gets what they need to thrive. And so looking at this picture, you see if these three young men are all given the same resources, they get a very different experience. But if they are given the resources that they need to enjoy this game, then you will see they all can have the same experience and without a loss from others around them. Of course, when you think about equity, though, and what you have to see here is that equity isn't just about individual decisions. It's about the system, right? So when you look at this picture, you have to also ask, who put that fence there in the first place? You have to ask, why are they watching a baseball game? I'd certainly be rather watching an American football game. Perhaps you all would rather be watching a soccer game. Who knows what you would rather be watching? But someone made the decision that they were watching baseball in the first place. Why is that even happening, right? So these decisions about equity aren't necessarily the individual decisions that people make to ensure equity is happening in their spaces. They're really about the systems in which we expect to see children growing and learning and reading. And once we start to address those systems and insist that all of our children are capable of learning within those systems, we can dismantle them in such a way and partner together to make sure that all of our children are thriving and learning in school. So thank you very much for joining me this evening for me, afternoon for you all. I really like to thank all my colleagues, researchers, students, teachers, just everyone I partner with to do the work that we do here. And I look forward to discussing my talk and any other questions you may have. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Nicole. That was terrific. Too many big things to think about. My brain is exploding. But look, while people are starting to think about questions, and please do type questions into the chat if you would like to, I might just take the opportunity again to introduce Manisha Gazula, our school principal, who I'm sure would have a lot of comments on what Nicole has said, and also would provide us with a little bit more of an Australian context in thinking about some of these things as they apply to schools. So Manisha, would you like to sort of kick off the discussion?
Sure, thanks, Anne, and thank you, Nicole. That was absolutely wonderful. And, you know, I was listening to everything that you said and cannot actually, probably whatever Nicole said, I can only just echo this, the belief and the words that came out of Nicole, because just to give a context of my school, for those who don't know where Marsden Road Public School is, it is in Sydney Southwest in Liverpool. Right now, we know Liverpool is very much in news every day because of the growing numbers of COVID cases and being one of those really LGAs that is people are not allowed to travel. Marsden Road Public School currently has an enrollment of 740 kids. It's the largest, it's one of the largest primary schools, in fact, the largest primary schools in Liverpool. We have about 95% of our students who come from a non-English speaking background, and 65% of those students have been speaking English for less than 3 years. So you can imagine these kids who are coming to our school, who have been in our school, and they have been only speaking or exposed to English language for less than 3 years. 20% of our students, so approximately looking at around 150 students, either come from a refugee background, mostly from Iraq or Syria, some from Afghanistan, some from Africa, and some of them haven't had any education whatsoever. So in terms of understanding the complexity of the school, understanding the context of what Nicole was saying, she was referring mostly to the Hispanic and the Black American African students in USA. But here we would have a mix of all those different socioeconomic status, racial status, or religion background. And we do have a very complex school, and a school that has to, we do get a lot of equity funding from the department to ensure that we provide the best resources. So that is the context of the school. And it is, as I said, we are in recent times, we have also seen a lot of migrants or refugees coming from Africa, but I think we are also preparing ourselves to take students from Afghanistan in the next few months, as soon as the borders open. So that's the context of the school. To be just, I have been the principal at the school for 6 years. The school has, because of the complexity and the students that we have, very high literacy needs, very high social needs, very high emotional issues, especially with students who have come from refugee background and who see sometimes authority or schools with a rather negative perspective than something as a positive thing, because a lot of our parents haven't been inside the school, and for them schooling is something that is they're so detached from, and it is a very foreign place. So we do battle those problems, but having said that, understanding the complexity and knowing what we have to do, and knowing very well that all students can read and write is the basis on which we run our school, has made a great progress, and we have seen great progress. In fact, I'd like to share with you, Anne, right now that yesterday, NAPLAN results were out yesterday, and we've had the best results since NAPLAN or BSD have started. So we have reached 28% of the premise, the premise prior to 30% of our students in the top bands. We have achieved 28%. The average in previous years has been 11, and this year we have struck, it has been an upwards growth. 25% 2 years ago was the best, and this year we have got 28%. So that just goes to show that all students can learn and read irrespective of any background. So yes, it's about how we put into what we do at our school that matters really.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Thank you for that. I'm not sure if we've got, it looks like there are some questions coming through. Perhaps I'll just pick up one point that I was hoping to be able to get input from both of you on, and that is this question that comes up all, sorry, that's my dog. And I can't, he's he's excited because he's going for a walk. He's not being slaughtered like it sounds. Is this question of children from non-English speaking backgrounds, and as you've both pointed out, it's not just in any one school. You have many different cultural backgrounds, languages, etc. This question of the extent to which they should be taught to read in their own language as well as in the language of the school, most typically English for us. I still find that from a research point of view, I don't feel as though I can ever quite find the research that gives me the answer to that question, but that question comes up so much. And will the children be disadvantaged if they have to immediately start learning in English, or should you teach them oral language in English first and then the reading? All of those sorts of questions. I don't know if either of you has any, grand ideas.
Nicole, do you want to speak first, or?
Sure, you can go ahead, Manisha.
Look, I really don't have the answer. It would be really difficult because we are not looking at one community language. We are looking at children coming, like in my school, we have 54 students coming from 54 different language backgrounds.
Yeah.
So really, it is not an easy solution to say, okay, let us teach them in a language, because I don't have teachers who can speak and teach in 54 different languages.
Exactly.
It does have that, and I just, or from a very personal point of view, because I was born and brought up in India, where 21 languages are actually official languages. So I went to an English medium school. So while I spoke a different language at home, the state spoke a different language because the state language was different, the school medium was different. So I do come from that, and I don't know whether I found it any different or challenging. So I really don't know whether teaching students to read and learn in their own language and then move on to become literate in their own language and then move on to English is going to have any, will make any difference or no. I'm not sure, because as you know, yourself mentioned, you haven't got enough research or knowledge about that in that field. Neither do I. But I don't feel that is necessarily could be an answer for our school, at least, because as I said, you're not looking at one language or two languages that students are coming from. It is a range of many different languages. So, and a lot of the students may be exposed to that language, but the parents might be, again, illiterate. They might only be able to speak in that language, but not read and write.
Yeah.
So, I'd rather look at how I can instruct them better in English and come up with it.
Yeah. Nicole, you feel the same way?
Yeah, I think so what my researcher had on, I would say that there is some research going back several years that more or less suggests that we should be taking advantage of the language strengths that children bring to school with them, right? Because languages fundamentally share so many different traits that if we can take advantage and scaffold and use that to promote learning of English or whatever the language is, the preferred language in the schooling context is, that can be helpful for our students. But there's a lot of variability, right? Whether or not the language that is to be learned is a desirable language, a language of social status or prestige, makes a difference. Whether or not there are multiple languages in that context in which we expect that learning to happen makes a difference. Whether or not the families, many families feel quite strongly that they want their children to learn the language of power in their context. And so they aren't necessarily supporting growth in their native languages at home, even though that might be helpful for their children, right? Yeah. So typically, I think that when we talk about whether or not bootstrapping can happen from the native language to the secondary language, we often in research don't think about all these contextual factors that make a difference to whether or not that happens in reality in schools. And in most schools, it's as Manisha put so eloquently, it really is, it really matters. You know, when I was working in schools in Atlanta before I moved to Tallahassee, one school district I worked in, just like what she described, had 70 plus languages available in that district. Certainly not enough teachers who were fluent in those native languages to begin instruction in a language other than English. Yeah. And so really the better question is, what do we do in that context, right? What do we do to support language learning in that context? And I don't think enough research has been done in that area yet.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks both. Danny, do you want to take over and field a few questions?
Sure, I can see that they're building up. So we'll try to get through as many as we can. So the first question there comes from Robin Weldall, and it says, and I think this is quite a big question, how do you manage all of the demands of the curriculum when you have so many children with complex backgrounds? How do you prioritize what gets covered?
Is it directed at me or Nicole? Or
It's got to be at you. There's no way that's at me.
So I didn't want to jump in. Yes, it is absolutely it's $1 million question, but we have to do it. And we believe that I think if you go to because Australia is a country with so much of a multicultural backgrounds, most schools in Australia would have the same complexity, if not as diverse as my school. But there would be that you would find very few schools just in the very few suburbs where it is predominantly English-speaking background families. Most schools would have more or less similar context as mine, but mine being a little bit more complex in the sense I have refugee students, low socioeconomic. Now, you're absolutely right asking me that question, how do you cater to these students? Yes, we have the policies. Yes, we have the systems. You have to have the policies. You have to have the systems. You have to have the caliber of staff that can provide for those students, because just having policies and a program and a system doesn't work if you do not have teachers with the capacity to deliver them. So to me, the topmost layer would be the professional learning of my teachers and supporting them with the necessary skills. For example, if you have a learning support team, you need to make sure that the teachers on this learning support team really know how to have good understanding of what intervention program works. When do you deliver them? How do you deliver them? How do you assess those programs? If you're having teachers who are classroom teachers, then what is their role in understanding how to deliver for the whole class and differentiate when you have students in the classroom whose capacity, some student might be learning or still learning at the year 2 level, and there might be students in the same class studying at year 6 level. And you might be teaching a year 5, but they're students of varying abilities. So then does that teacher have the capacity to differentiate? And how does she know whether the differentiation that she's doing in the classroom is working or not? All that requires intense professional learning and development and ongoing. So I think what we have done at our school is we are very clear with what we want and what works. Research has played a very important role. So we have taken into consideration all the evidence from research. And I don't, because I know this research-based and evidence-based is just being thrown around left, right, and center. So it is very important to understand that when you say and you make that claim, that you have done your homework. When I say we have achieved some of the results, it's not because it's an overnight. We started this in 2016, and after 5 years of hard work, we are seeing the fruit. So it is that ongoing professional learning, having the systems in place, not getting dejected because the gains are going to be very slow and gradual. And it's only later on you're going to see it. So by working hard for 1 or 2 years and sustaining that kind of diligence is also a challenge. But it is a top-down and a bottom-up effort. So from top-down, you have to see that you are well abreast of what works, what happens in the school, and that you are supporting your teacher. And the teachers need to know that if they are well supported by the upper management and the middle management. And then the lower tier, they need to know that this is not just the responsibility and the professional learning that goes hand in hand has to come from, or it has to be supported by the community. I think it is a cultural shift that we've had at our school. When I first came at the school, I was told that I saw that the kids were wearing different colored hats. And I said, why are the kids wearing different colored hats? Why can't they wear a school hat? And the response was, oh, you're so lucky that they at least got a hat, Manisha. So that expectation that this community will not even provide a school hat for their kids was just accepted because it's a poor community. That's what they do. 2 months on, I gave everybody a hat. Every school kid had a uniform. And that's it. The rule was no kid comes to the school without a proper school uniform. And today we have every kid that walks into the school with the right uniform, because the parents are thinking, oh, I can't send my school with, it wasn't that they couldn't afford it. They just didn't see it. It was never expected of them to do it. Whereas you go in a different school, it's an expectation. So the expectation has changed from the community. So what I mean to say is, it is not one thing that we have done. You have to have a lot of systems in terms of expectations from the community, for the community, from the kids, for the kids, from the teachers. And alongside, you have to have the professional development for the teachers. I know it's multi-layered things. You have to do many things to have a system and a school that provides to a complex community. And it's probably not easy for me to say, we did this and this is how it works. Does that, I have succinctly tried to put an answer to a very broad question. All right.
Yeah, I thought that was great. Yeah. I see that in the chat, Rebecca sort of asked me from a research perspective, what do you do about that? And I think, so I would say there's a lot of what Manisha's saying, I mirror a lot of that in my approach too. So I do think you have to work from the top down and the bottom up. And so I'm working with teachers in classrooms, but I'm also working with school and district leaders as well, even state leaders, to help make a difference in what's happening for kids in our own backyard. I also think you have to take this from a long game perspective. This is not something that's going to be resolved overnight, and you have to commit and I do think that's why this partnership work is so important, because partnerships suggest nobody's going anywhere. You're going to be there for a while, for the long run, as things move and change, and you have to move and change with those. And then thirdly, I think, as Manisha is saying, there are so many different challenges that you might be facing in any given school. And I don't presume to not be the expert in all of those things. Instead, I think it's my job to make sure I get other people to the table who might have that expertise. I know what I happen to know about reading and language and literacy, but if they have a concern with 9th grade algebra and I don't do that, I work at a university. Somebody there does that, right? So how can I help bring that person and that knowledge and expertise to the table? I think it would be really great, and I think you're starting to see many researchers do this, try to figure out how to fold different interventions and approaches together. So they will tackle academic and behavioral interventions at the same time, for example, and see if we can make those things happen. Design assessments that look for risk for reading difficulty and risk for trauma at the same time. Some of our colleagues here at FCRR are trying to do that now. So if we recognize the reality is that if we walk into a school and we can't give 20 hours of assessment to cover every single area that might be in need for children in that school, then how can we put our brilliant research hats on and figure out how to make that work in a real school, in a real place? And that means, can you look at these things together? And traditionally, we haven't done that because partnership is hard. It's hard to do with schools, but it's hard to do amongst ourselves too. But if we intend to see these changes happen in places where the need is the greatest, and we expect people, professionals like Manisha, to put up with us, we've got to figure out how to make that happen, how to get more of us to the table to work together on the problems that she identifies are her biggest priorities. And then we might see this slowly but surely start to make this dent in the work that we want to do for our kids and families.
Thank you so much. I'm just looking through the questions and trying to think where to go next from such a wonderful, wide-ranging overview. I might zoom in a little bit because we have a couple of questions there about the practicalities of screening for early difficulties when children are speaking English as a second or third language, and screeners for identifying literacy difficulties. So do any of you have any suggestions to offer on those questions?
Yeah, I can probably answer a little bit of that. So we do have, I enroll anything between 100 to 120 kindergarten students. So what we have is an early, we have a program. So for example, unfortunately, we couldn't do it this year. We can't do it this year because of COVID. But just going back in historically, what we have done is we try to complete all our enrollment by term 3. And in term 4, we actually get our kids to come to attend school 2 days a week. Almost like, what do you call them? Preschool? Yeah, so preschool, that's the word I was looking for. So, and in my school, I actually engage a teacher and an SLSO, which is a student learning support officer, or teacher's aide in the old title. we actually then get the kids to our school 2 days a week for 10 weeks. So it's during that time, and it's only groups of 10. And at that time, I also engage a speech pathologist and an occupational therapist to visit those classes. So that's when they are in that environment, when we're preparing them. So we do a bit of phonemic awareness during that time. We look at their pencil grips, we look at their language skills. So it really helps because the teachers there, the expert teachers there, along with the speech therapist and the occupational therapist, so we assess, actually we screen all 120 kids in those 10 weeks. We get a good inclination of which are the kids that are going to need the support in language, which kids have speech impediments, or if they have any other intellectual disability. So we do a lot of assessment during those 10 weeks of time. And if we do find there are kids that are very high needs, our school counselor gets involved and we run the proper testing on them as well. So we do all those screenings in the term 4 of the year before. So we know then what the needs are as they come into kindergarten, which really has greatly helped, because as you saw, a lot of the kids, we realize that they've never spoken a word of English or never heard English. So then we have to then make sure that they're getting the early intervention as soon as they come to kindergarten, the first day at school. They get pulled out to have intensive language, language immersion courses. So we have those kind of interventions and programs in place to help with those early schoolers.
Mm-hmm. I would only add, and keeping in mind that my area of expertise is not in bilingual assessment or instruction. However, what little I know, I think 2 other things I would add to that, and that you hear Manisha saying it, you have to make sure you understand the language proficiency for the child you're working with in the native language and or in the language you're intending to teach, right? And so it's fundamentally, you need to make sure you understand if the issue is a learning issue or a language difference issue, right? The other thing you might take a look at is research that's been done on dynamic assessments, which are designed in that way to think about whether or not the intent there is to capture learning. So you can see whether or not the child is having difficulty learning new concepts, or if it is indeed just a language difference. If it's a language difference, then I'm sure, I think probably what you're referring to as your language immersion programs are what are really helpful for those students, and they will quickly pick up skills they need necessary to transition into learning in the language of instruction in the schools, which may be English. But for kids who have learning difficulties or speech and language difficulties or other difficulties that might impede learning, that will be captured in a dynamic assessment if you find that students aren't learning, right? And then, like all other screenings, I guess that's the third thing, is that screenings are intended to happen multiple times, right? So you screen early, you do a little teaching, and you come back again to make sure, and you continue to screen to make sure that you're seeing the progress you expect to see in students, or shift accordingly if you don't.
And that's probably, one of the things that why it is important to have that equity funding, because I can engage a speech therapist and occupational therapist 3 days a week at my school. And the first 2 terms of the semester, they work in kindergarten and year 1. Exactly for what Nicole said, where we have to continue. You can't just assess them once and let go, because you've got to follow through after intervention to assess them every 6 weeks. But you've got to have the fundings to be able to do that. Unfortunately, I do have the funding to do that.
Nicole, I could just see there was a question there asking if you could define dynamic assessment.
Sure. So dynamic assessment, and if you look in the research literature, you will see that term, dynamic assessment. And it is just an approach to assessment that is contrasted to what we typically think of as static assessments. In static assessments, you're just asking a question and looking for an answer or looking for a response. Your standard multiple choice question type of assessment, for example, is a static assessment, or an assessment type where you might ask a student to fill in the blank with a one-word response is a static assessment. A dynamic assessment happens over several items where you're providing context in which you expect a student to demonstrate a particular skill. And then you change that context systematically to see if they shift in their performance based on that context. And that's one way in which you can mimic learning that might be happening for that student. And so that's what you're looking for in a dynamic assessment.
Thank you, Nicole. So I have another question here. I think this one is for Manisha. Do you have experiences building groups within your school, perhaps where students who all speak one language can interact and talk about text in their first languages and in English? Is this something that you have ever done?
We do. We do have it, and I do it for Arabic students because that's the largest group that I have, and also in terms of a refugee intake, that's probably the large number because we have a lot of refugees from Iraq and Syria. So we do have a program where we get all the students in the mornings from 9 to 11 together in a class, and we call them the New Arrivals program, and they are immersed and they're taught in Arabic. Because again, it's not necessarily always, just because they can't speak English doesn't mean they can't learn in a different language. So the maths instruction, the science instruction is done there with an SLSO who speaks Arabic. So yes, we do have that, and it does, and it also helps them integrate in the school socially as well. Because imagine if you can't speak the language and you come to a school and everybody's speaking a language you can't understand, it can be a little bit daunting. So we do have that program where we are doing it, and it works actually quite well, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. And I think this next one is also a question for you. It's just about the learning support teachers. So Rhonda Film was making a point that they can have a very variable skill base, but I suppose this comes back to what you were talking about in terms of professional development and that sort of thing.
That's right. If you're looking at if you're going into a classroom and you're withdrawing students for small group instruction, how are you going to give that small group instruction? Because within that small group, you might take 3 students, but even then, again, the learning needs might be very different of those 3 students. So how then, as a learning support teacher, how do you identify what is the learning need of this child? Because, as Nicole pointed out, it can't be, it may be a language deficiency, or it may be a learning issue. So you have to identify those differences, and then accordingly, then how the learning support team works with the teacher to form the groups, to plan the programs. You have to have those kind of understanding whether, tomorrow if you start talking to me in Mandarin and start teaching me algebra in Mandarin, I'm not going to understand. It doesn't mean I can't understand algebra. That's where, you have to really come to, you have to have the skills to know, to identify the students, how to assess, when to assess. Those are kind of skills that only a teacher with experience and a good understanding, cognitive science, understanding of good cognitive science, very important for teachers to know how students learn, how the mind works, how much of, how much front loading should be done, how much of what kind of questions should be asked, when to ask an open-ended question, when to ask a close-ended question. These are not something that you can just do randomly. You have to be strategic about those skills and when to use those strategies. So I think that kind of training, but again, it is not a one-off training. You cannot say to me that I'm going to give a professional learning to my learning support teachers on how to help and differentiate and cater to student learning teams. It has to be an ongoing training, making them understand. I think I started with cognitive science. We did a lot of cognitive load theory with my staff for a whole year. We actually spent an entire year learning and understanding cognitive load theory before we went on to how students learn. So it is a very slow, but quite rewarding and quite, I feel impactful professional learning.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic, thank you. So now we have a question for Nicole. I can see it's quite a long one, so I'll read it out. It says, do you have a sense of what the research says about the ideal level of text complexity for students in a classroom who are still approaching grade level? Is it more effective to provide kids who are still approaching grade level reading with slightly more challenging texts, providing that teachers are there to put scaffolds in place, rather than providing them with independent level texts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see it there. So I think the research question, the evidence base is still out on this one, right? It's an active question, and I think people are really actually quite earnestly investigating at the moment. I think preliminary research evidence seems to suggest that for students, it is helpful to present them with a wide variety of texts, including texts that they cannot read at independent levels, and supporting them to read that text. And large part that has to do with it. It sounds like you're coming to some of that from your question. There's a lot of discussion around knowledge, these days as it relates to comprehension and understanding text. And oftentimes texts that have been designed for kids who might be struggling with reading don't have the kind of complex language structures and knowledge content available to support the comprehension we expect to see as they move along in school. And so it is thought that some of that has to do with the text that we present to students. And as a result, we should make sure that we're giving kids access to texts that are well beyond their word reading ability in order to support their knowledge and comprehension skills. But the research is still out on that. We're still trying to make sure that doing those practices will actually result in differences in reading outcomes for kids. However, that said, I do think it makes good sense, right? That when we think about this construct of comprehension, which is ever evolving amongst us researchers, because we are all coming to understand that we don't quite know what it is and know how best to assess it, and quite frankly, know how best to teach it. But what we do know is that when you look at standards and what it is that we expect teachers to teach students in classrooms and what we expect students to know and be accountable for on state tests and accountability testing that we see in schools, it really requires quite a bit of knowledge from content area text, whether it be science or social studies or literature. There's a lot of content there that we expect kids to know. And that just doesn't happen overnight like anything else with language and literacy. And so we've got to be exposing children to really complex thought and really complex content. And that's going to require exposing them to a wide variety of texts, even from very young ages, even before they can read those read the words in those texts.
Thank you. Fantastic. So we have another question here from Hannah, and this may be one of our last questions because we're running out of time. And she asks, and this is probably a question for all of you, I think, how has home learning during COVID lockdowns impacted on reading skills and development? Have you recognized many challenges with this? And if so, what challenges specifically?
Look, I can probably start because I am in the school with COVID right now and dealing with those issues. Of course, it has impacted. I mean, I think there's no doubt about that in my mind. And I don't know about last year. We were in lockdown last year for 7 weeks. And we thought, okay, I don't know how this is going to impact because, as I said, with our kids, 50% of my students did not have any devices. So when we did a survey, nearly 350 students did not have any access to device. Or if they had, they were sharing it with their siblings. We had, at this point, I remember delivering 360 paper packages to my students to do it at home. Now, I have no idea how these kids are doing their work. So for not having seen them for 10 weeks, not having that instruction with them, face-to-face instruction, absolutely is going to have some impact. The depth of it or how much of it, I have no idea. Last year, I can talk about last year, it didn't make much of a difference because we thought it would, 7 weeks of online learning, but it did not reflect in when they came back to school. We actually did our in-school nap plan. Last year, if you remember, last year, the nap plan was canceled. But we did it at our school. We actually did one at our school just to make sure that, to analyze if the kids were falling behind after having 7 weeks of online learning. We didn't see much impact then. I don't know about now. We haven't really done any assessment as such, being offline or being online learning. We are continuing to do a lot of a MacLit and Multilit program via Zoom. So we are still doing the small instructions. So I have got my SLSOs actually and my instructional leaders reading to 3 or 4 kids for 20 minutes every day from kindergarten to year 2. So we have tried to maintain that, and that is probably to minimize the impact of COVID on online learning. It's only when they come back next term, and even then we're coming back only in week 5, and when we really do some significant one-on-one assessment, that's when we'll know whether it has had any long-term, probably, whether it has really disadvantaged our students. To some degree, some of the students would have, who probably are not doing anything right now, who are probably not doing the online paper, or they don't have any access to Zoom, because we have tried, there are about 20 or 30 students who I cannot get on to even come on Zoom to do that one-on-one reading. And these are probably the most vulnerable students. So I can just see them regressing. But again, we will have what we did last year when we came back, we had the COVID ILSP money. So I ran before and after school tutoring with that money. So these students will be, again, I didn't want to pull them out of class because then that's meaningless. So we actually got them into school at 7:30 in the morning. And then after school, we had them till 4 o'clock. We provided breakfast and we provided afternoon tea and some time for them to play. But then we were doing that intensive small group instruction with those kids, and which I plan to do again next term and the next and following year, just to minimize the gap that might be occurring. Or I don't know, I can't give you a specific number as to how many kids have regressed. Hopefully not many.
So in the US, it's a probably similar situation for us. So kids have just come out of summer breaks, and so they've just started school back. And so the numbers are just coming in for estimates of what has been unfortunately termed learning loss. A lot of people using the term learning loss here. I personally think it's an inaccurate term, because in that last school year we're trying to document, kids were learning in one way or another, whether it was remote or hybrid or in person or on Zoom or off Zoom or hard sheets. Kids were learning, although they might not have been learning under the conditions that we hoped for. Teachers were working hard and kids were learning. But what we are seeing is what is probably not very surprising to most of you, is that there are very large disparities in the amount of learning that happened in that time period. And it is our children who are most vulnerable to not doing well in school, who tended to demonstrate the poorest outcomes thus far. So that's our children from race and cultural and linguistic minority backgrounds, kids who are growing up in poverty, kids who are growing up attending schools that were already struggling. Children in those conditions seem to fare much worse academically during this last year than otherwise. And we do have national federal funds as well as local funds that have been provided. It sounds very similar to you all, to try to dedicate some additional resources and supports to those kids to mitigate what has happened for them over the last year. I think it's important, and again, I think this context thing, we are sometimes so narrowly focused on the things that matter most to us that we don't see the bigger picture. And what we're seeing, I think, in much of this data is an expected response to being educated during a global pandemic. So all we're seeing is a compounding of what was already happening for many of our children in our schools. And there is an urgency to respond, but there has always been an urgent need to respond. And so this perhaps is an opportunity for us to double down and really make sure that the decisions we're making in our schools to support our children and our families are really based on the best available evidence that we have possible and the best resources that we have possible to dedicate it to the folks who are most in need. It is something we should have always been doing, but I think it's just ever presently clear at this moment that we really don't have a second to waste to do that now.
Yes, I think
that's a very inspiring note to end on. Anne, did you want to?
Yes, I was just going to say the same thing. I think that's a very inspiring note to end on. And also, I think it is fair to say if any other positive has come out of the pandemic, it's that teachers have never been more appreciated in entire of history, I don't think, because the parents out there who've got some kind of insight of what they're doing every day with their kids, times 20 of them, it's just so hopefully some of the teacher respect that we all know should be there will lift up a little bit with this wonderful experience we're all going through. Yes, it is right on 12:30, so we'll wrap it up there. Once again, I just can't thank you enough, Nicole and Manisha. That was a really, a really fascinating presentation, but also a really interesting discussion afterwards with your complementary research and on the ground principal skills. I think it made for a really valuable discussion. I'm going to have to go back and listen to the recording of all the answers so I can get them there. So once again, thank you very much. And we hope to see you again, both of you, in the flesh next time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Happy International Literacy Day.
Yes, happy Literacy Week. And thank you for the privilege and the opportunity. It was an absolute great discussion and, you know, great presentation, Nicole. Well done.
Thank you. So lovely to meet you.
And
Happy to do this anytime. We should take this show on the road.
Yeah, let's take it on the road.
Good job on Macquarie University.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.